Hi everyone, it's Gemma, host of the show. Before we start this episode, I've got a little request for you. We're living in uncertain times. Powerful leaders are promoting disinformation that supports their preferred ideology. Inconvenient facts and the institutions that share them are being challenged and threatened. And freedoms vital to healthy democracies are under threat. Against this background, the conversation's role has never been more important. The world needs an independent platform where experts can share knowledge without fear or censorship. We're a charitable organisation with a small team dedicated to publishing high-quality work in partnership with researchers and academics around the world. We are not bankrolled by a shadowy oligarch or media baron, nor is the conversation owned by an opaque offshore corporation. Our funding comes from our university partners, foundations, and from listeners and readers like you. So please consider supporting us by going to donate.theconversation.com. That's donate.theconversation.com. Giving us your backing will help us to carry on making vital expert analysis free to access for everyone. Thanks very much, and now on with this week's episode. It's been 3 months since the Trump administration began to make drastic cuts to its aid agency, USAID.
Today, the Trump administration dismissed nearly $60 billion in foreign aid grants and contracts.
All USAID overseas missions will be shut down.
Shock and confusion after U.S. President Donald Trump ordered a freeze and review of foreign aid.
Donald Trump has long been a critic of American aid, arguing that it's not aligned with American interests.
We're giving foreign aid to countries that hate us. If you look at the numbers in terms of the billions and even trillions of dollars that we give to foreign aid, and yet we don't protect our own border, we don't protect our own military.
Now, Trump is by no means the first person to criticise the aid industry. Debates about the effectiveness of foreign aid have rumbled on for decades, taking in everything from the way development assistance is distributed and spent to what happens to countries who become dependent on it. So in this episode, we're speaking to an African aid expert about where the decimation of USAID leaves the debate about the future of aid. I'm Gemma Ware, and you're listening to The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. I'm joined to begin this episode by Adejuwon Soyinka, Regional Editor for West Africa for The Conversation. Welcome to the podcast, Adejuwon.
Thank you, Gemma. It's nice to be here.
So, Adejuwon, I want to talk to you about the significance of these USAID cuts. Now, the US gave $63 billion of overseas development assistance in 2024. That represents 30% of all aid distributed by countries in the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. What do these USAID cuts mean for the African continent, and which countries will be hardest hit?
Going by its size alone, Nigeria tops the list in almost all instances, with a country with a population of over 200 million people, so it's obviously one of the largest recipients of aid from Washington. So about $600 million was invested by the US government in health assistance to the country in 2023 alone. Funds also went into providing humanitarian assistance such as shelter and sanitation in Nigeria's northeast region, where an insurgency has displaced hundreds of thousands of people who now live as refugees within their country. But outside Nigeria, if you look in the direction of South Africa, for instance, where they cut $400 million for HIV programs, meant that there's a risk of patients defaulting on treatment, on infection rates going up, and eventually a rise in number of deaths as a result of HIV and AIDS infection in the country. My colleagues in the eastern region of Africa have also collaborated with researchers whose work have shown that US aid cuts is making famine in war-torn Sudan, for instance, the deadliest for half a century. So you could see the impact, in Nigeria and the Sahel region of West Africa, for instance, spreading into Niger, Chad, and all the way up.
What's been the reaction to the USAID cuts in Nigeria?
Well, I think most of the reaction has been from the government. The Nigerian government simply acknowledged the impact of the funding cuts and reassured citizens that they would ensure continued access to treatment, especially for people living with HIV. And the Nigerian lawmakers also stepped in by approving an additional 200 million US dollars for the health sector, saying that the funds will be used to fill the gap left by the suspension of US foreign aid.
Are people in Nigeria, in West Africa, talking about this or not really?
People talked about it, especially immediately after the funding cut was announced. And I think a lot of the conversation around it had been about the likely impact this could have on services. There were also questions or discussions around the impact of corruption on provision of services in Nigeria. Because, situations like that remind people of the fact that the country is quite resource rich and should indeed not have any reason to depend on foreign aid or support to be able to manage for instance, critical health concerns of its citizens. So usually when things like this happen, it raises questions around the impact of corruption and wastage of national resources. However, there is an aspect of likely impact of the foreign aid cuts that a lot of people didn't quite talk about. The angle of security, actually, the likely impact of US aid cuts for Nigeria's fight against Islamist insurgency and banditry, especially in the country's northeast and northwest region. Groups like Boko Haram, Al Qaeda in the Maghreb, and all sorts of criminal elements that have infiltrated that region for more than 2 decades.
What questions are these aid cuts leaving you with about the future of aid and development assistance in Africa?
The kind of questions that comes to mind for me was the question of Africa's overdependence on foreign aids for critical sectors of life and economy. It just raises the question of what exactly is wrong with the leadership on the continent. How is it possible that since the US launched the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS relief in 2003 and saved about 26 million lives and prevented nearly 8 million babies from being born with HIV globally, right? 22 years after that, African countries were still caught napping when the US government withdrew the program. It speaks volume about the continent's lack of planning and also, apparent unwillingness to take up its responsibilities of taking care of its own citizens. One of the questions it raises also is, should the entire continent continue to rely on imported vaccines, for instance? What has happened to the idea of actually looking inward and developing the capacity to produce these vaccines? Because a lot of the support funding coming in goes into buying vaccines and kits that we then end up importing into the continent. So it just raises the question of lack of preparation, lack of planning, lack of willingness to take on what should be our responsibility as a people and as a continent. Now, this is not the first time this kind of aid cuts would happen. If you recall, in 2020, the UK government reduced overseas development aid. And that created a scenario where about 72 million people missed out on treatments for neglected tropical diseases between 2021 and 2022 across the continent. So that should have been some kind of dress rehearsal for us on the continent about what could potentially happen when these kind of major cuts happen. But unfortunately, it seems that the lessons were not learned. And then the US came along, and we've seen this kind of impact, across the region.
Big questions. And we're hoping that this conversation we're about to hear in this episode will help answer some of them. So thank you so much, Jowan, for coming on. It's been a pleasure having you on.
Thank you, Tema. It's been nice speaking with you.
We wanted to speak to an expert about the history and future of development aid, and we were delighted that Bright Simons agreed to speak with us. Bright is a visiting senior fellow at the Overseas Development Institute in London, and he's also an analyst at the Imani think tank in Ghana, where he's a prominent political and economic commentator. Bright, welcome to the podcast. We're talking a few months after the Trump administration began its drive to dismantle USAID. What was your initial reaction to those first USAID cuts?
Initially it was outright shock, like most people. We all knew that there was a very concerted effort and a very committed agenda to make drastic changes to the way the US is positioned in the world. And obviously the US's foreign policy framework includes aid. So there was an expectation that there was going to be massive shifts in the way that aid was approached. What we did not expect was to witness the mass firings, the attempt to back out of programs for which contracts had already been signed and Congress had already authorized funds.
And how significant do you view these cuts, particularly in Africa? What impact are they having?
A lot of the specific aid programs that were targeted were very critical to specific life-saving programs in specific countries. So you had countries like Uganda, countries like Nigeria, where HIV response was upwards of 60% dependent on US money, or other particular types of diseases. So while in the broader scheme of things, US aid in Africa is pretty small. So basically it's about $12 billion roughly. So you're talking of something that is less than 0.5% of GDP in Africa. But that notwithstanding, you have specific countries. Think of Central African Republic, think of South Sudan, countries that are very dependent on aid. Even Rwanda, often seen as a very dynamic country, has about 10% of its GDP dependent on aid. So in those countries that aid is being cut dramatically, it can affect confidence in the economy. Then in specific countries, even countries like Nigeria that are not dependent on aid at all, maybe 1% of Nigeria's federal budget is heavily aid dependent. It's the same in Ghana. We have 0.3% of our GDP being grants. That notwithstanding, you have a very strong set of programs in the country where the US is the main player. Nature-based tourism, historical and heritage-based tourism. Another would be specific programs in health, like in PEPFAR, which is focused on HIV response. So that was the challenge. It was a very variegated picture. It was not the same picture all across the continent, but there were specific spots that were very badly hit.
Bright, I'd like to get a bit of history about how foreign aid developed to the point where it is today. The beginning of foreign aid is often traced back to the period after World War II, when the US began helping to rebuild countries in Europe affected by the war. Is that where you see its origin story?
If you focus on the more humanitarian, the more friendship kind of driven narrative around aid, the post-war period was very significant. So that kind of humanitarian, stepping in when a neighbor's house is on fire kind of mindset to aid is certainly post-war. The truth, though, is that when you think of foreign aid in the more developmental sense, as in relying on resources from other countries to support your own development as a country, that goes way back. So basically from 1750 onwards. In that modern era, you have a very significant record of, for instance, the United States relying a lot on Dutch money, on French money, buying Louisiana, United States from France, from Napoleon, and the US had to rely on Dutch money from the Netherlands, building some of the major infrastructure in the early Republican period in the US. Then you move obviously to the post-war period. And in the post-war period, yes, much of this comes to its own with the establishment of the multilateral development banks, with the setup of the first set of development assistance principles within the OECD.
The OECD is short for the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's an intergovernmental organisation of 38 countries focusing on promoting economic growth, and it also runs the Development Assistance Committee, a forum to discuss and measure aid spending.
A lot of that was consolidated in the post-war period, which is after 1945, after the Second World War.
USAID itself was created in 1961, I believe, under John F. Kennedy during the Cold War. And some scholars have argued that foreign aid grew to prevent the spread of communism and foster free trade. Do you think that's had any influence on where agencies like USAID have ended up, have arrived at?
Certainly, in the beginning, I would say let's look at the initial post-war phase, which was very much acute reconstruction needs that countries in Europe had with the Marshall Plan. It was very much emergency funding. And in that era, political competition wasn't very strong. Then you had the Soviet Union become very powerful and start to build the Warsaw Bloc, where it used aid as a very important element of trying to sustain countries undergoing the transition to communism. And the West naturally had to respond. And you saw aid ratchet up in Japan, in South Korea, and various other places where essentially you wanted to prop up your ideological allies in order not to either have them fall victim or be tempted by aid from Russia and the Soviet Union in those days.
During this era, aid was a geopolitical tool. Money flowed based on political allegiances, with donors using aid to pull recipient countries into their orbit during the Cold War.
Often it to be based purely on politics. This particular country wants this agenda and they will send this amount of money or food or whatever. But sometime around 1968, some technocrats who took the notion seriously, that this was really about development, started to have concerns around the nature of aid and its arbitrariness and its lack of consistency with long-term planning. And over time, those principles that were espoused, it was actually called partnership in development, which is where the notion of development partnerships come from. Also, this was where the proposal was made for countries to devote a specific percentage of their GDP to aid, which would then be ratified by the United Nations in 1970, 1971. Now, all of that was an attempt to move away from the arbitrariness of geopolitical competition being the driver of this aid decision-making. And so an attempt of professionalizing aid by focusing on technocratic excellence, people knowing what they're doing. How does a country build a better health system? How do you use the resourcing to achieve that? How does a country build a better educational system? And now I call it the Brussels paradigm, that set of ideas very anchored in Europe. Those Brussels norms dominate the classical paradigm. It's this view that when it comes to development, we have a very good sense of what works. And based on how these principles are meant to apply, money should move consistently with that. And a lot of the criticism nowadays stem from a belief that it's a bit overambitious, it's a bit hubristic, that we really don't know how development works, and every country has its own trajectory and culture plays a role. And a lot of the criticisms that I have and others have will be based on analyzing the track record of that particular approach and its consequences and ramifications.
For decades now, this has been the dominant model of development aid across Africa, and it follows a sort of blueprint mentality. The idea is that if you gather enough experts, draft a framework around development and get countries to align their policies with it, growth and stability will follow.
My view is that increasingly those blueprints, they are hollow in the sense that they just everything. You throw everything in and solve gender problems, solve youth problems, solve problems to do with governance at the domestic level, reform global financial architecture, everything you can think of. These are laundry lists. And you pour everything into the broth, and then you hope there's something flavorful come out of it. And in truth, it doesn't really provide a clear set of ideas about how a country should prioritize and get out of its specific unique circumstances. And that has been the big critique.
Bright says the more transactional and geopolitically driven type of aid is making a comeback, and it's not only through Trump's actions.
Increasingly interesting and increasingly relevant alternative, the St. Petersburg model of aid, which is basically what Russia and some of the BRICS countries are promoting, of increasing very transactional aid under the name of sovereignty. So we don't question your internal systems, we just focus on where we can do a deal, we do an exchange of some kind, mutually beneficial. That kind of model also has issues.
We'll be coming onto those issues shortly. But first, we wanted to tell you about another podcast you may enjoy.
Every week, Michelle Grattan offers you a ringside seat to the latest in Australian politics with interviews and insights from political insiders. On the Conversations Politics with Michelle Grattan podcast, we cut through the spin and get to the substance with independent analysis of the issues that really matter. Stay informed, search and follow Politics with Michelle Grattan wherever you get your podcasts. For all the critiques of the different ways to structure aid,
Bright Simmons told me that there are a number of countries that have used external development funding to very effectively develop their economies.
Japan used World Bank funding to build infrastructure like power plants and things like that. Of course, they did not depend entirely on World Bank funding. Japan was an incredible country when it comes to mobilizing domestic savings, long-term domestic savings for development. But it also used some World Bank money to build some infrastructure, which was relatively useful. China is a more conclusive story or definitive story in the sense that it did use a lot of foreign aid in different ways. It used aid from Japan in particular, a lot of soft loans from Japan. The last disbursement of that was as late as 2022. And within that period, about $21 billion in nominal terms. This was very well used. As we all now know, China became the factory of the world. It of course also used a lot of foreign direct investment, etc. But it doesn't change the fact that money from outside coming to a country has often been critical in moving a country from one level to another. South Korea is a good example. Singapore is a good example. All of these Asian tigers, their share of global FDI, foreign direct investment, was above many multiples what African countries have got. So that means that depending on foreign money is not something that you can ignore. The point though is that the way in which the money flows matters.
Put into a global perspective, the amount of foreign aid available is actually very small. And so Bright argues that countries who receive it need to be strategic about every dollar invested.
If you take all the aid that we spend on global health, for instance, it's less than how much the rich world spends on chocolate in a year. So that's what we're talking about. If you take all the money that we spend on the likes of Gavi, Global Fund, and the rest, it's less than Pokemon merchandise. So it's not a lot of money. For it to be effective, then it has to be very catalytic, which means it has to be very well prioritized and applied to the right things. And on top of that, it has to be monitored effectively. To be able to prioritize effectively, know where to apply the money, you need policy making. You need to be able to, as a country, design the right policies that enable you to focus on the right things at the right time, sequencing. If you don't do that sequencing well, you get into debt traps. And then everybody talks about debt forgiveness. It doesn't matter where the resources come from, whether it's through aid, whether it's through foreign direct investment, whether it's through your domestic savings. You need to be able to convert that money into some transformative investments.
For a recent study conducted for a think tank based in France, Bright analysed some of the World Bank's portfolio of project loans to Ghana between 2010 and 2022. He and his team selected a representative sample of projects that were supposedly doing well according to the World Bank.
So we've been reviewing the World Bank's portfolio in Ghana, and we've done a lot of digging into doing things that people traditionally don't do. Going out there and actually looking at the projects, examining them head to toe, without assuming that what we read in the reports are correct. And we found some really interesting things, including projects that are on paper to exist that don't really exist because somehow the money has been spent, things have been created, but they were never used. A good example is the e-gates or the e-immigration system of Ghana. $20 million spent, none of that is in use.
The installation of these e-gates at Ghana's international airport was part of a World Bank-funded programme to upgrade the country's immigration system. But Bright says he's never seen evidence of the gates at the airport. A spokesperson for the World Bank insisted to the conversation that the gates were installed in Terminal 2 of the airport, but were not relocated when international flights were moved to Terminal 3. They said, "This is unfortunate, but decisions taken by the government go beyond the scope of the project and the World Bank's remit." Separately, a local company has now been contracted by the government to install e-gates as part of a wider digital border management system.
So what happened to that $20 million? More or less, to my mind, wasted.
A World Bank spokesperson said claims of non-existing or non-functioning programs are not correct. They said that the projects the World Bank funds are implemented by recipient governments and governed by rigorous policies meant to prevent the misuse of funds and ensure our loans are used for the purposes intended. They added that the World Bank has stringent accountability mechanisms in place to prevent fraud or corruption in the projects that we finance.
Do you find yourself agreeing in any way with Donald Trump's assessment of aid and the aid industry as full of waste and abuse?
No, because he comes from it from a very different point of view. He comes from it from primarily about U.S. interests in the world and whether or not these things advance U.S. interests in the world, right? Secondly, he doesn't tackle the issues around how that money got spent in respect of contractors in Europe and the USA benefiting. I don't think he has a big problem with that.
You've argued the distribution of aid by multilateral institutions, say the UN or the World Bank, does have advantages over that bilateral relationship. You still think that's got more accountabilities than, say, a relationship with USAID or with the UAE or with China or Russia?
So in theory, there is room for that kind of accountability. Whether or not you are allowed to actually exercise it is a different matter. In the bilateral aid programs, which I call the new model, which is the St. Petersburg model, which is very heavily bilateral between country to country, the problem there is often there is no mechanism created within the program for a bystander in that sense. And the bystander could actually be a citizen of the country to demand information and to receive that information. All of these lead to the same thing. You go to Nigeria right now, they are abandoning Chinese projects. Nobody knows much about why these projects were abandoned, but they are very similar to why projects that are funded by Western organizations also sometimes don't perform. And in all of these instances, the real issue is accountability to the people, right, of the host country. You have to account to a group of people in the country that are in the policy community. Both types of aid today undermine that policy community and its formation.
This is the dependency issue as well in some ways.
This is the dependency issue in the sense that you don't have a learning curve to get out of aid because you don't know enough about what is working, what is not working, why it's not working, to chart a path that gets you away from that dependency. A lot of the aid-funded models, whether it's Chinese-backed or whether it's West-backed, etc. in Africa, suffer from what I call the great power learning curve in Africa. All of them start at the same level, infrastructure. Then they quickly discover that without syncing the hard development with the soft development, you don't get productivity boosts. If you don't get a productivity boost, the country can't pay for the power plant or the dam or the road. And so you get a debt crisis that creates a crisis of confidence. They then dial back from infrastructure and they look for other commercial opportunities. And then the new power comes in and that's the same. And now that the Chinese are retrenching from large-scale infrastructure projects, the UAE, Saudi and others are coming on board, going through the same cycle. So the view is that the lack of learning, not only on the part of the Africans, but on part of the great power partners of Africa, the people that are counterparties to the Africans in these deals, the lack of learning increasingly creates situations where the same problems are repeated. And that is why you don't see enough graduation from dependency, because the money gets spent, but transformation doesn't happen due to the fact that mistakes don't feed into new ideas and new strategies in order to get better and to move to the next level of development.
So what you're painting is a picture where there are kind of flushes of money and then they get withdrawn and some partners come in and then they leave. Talking about the moment we're in now, though, there's obviously the USAID that's being withdrawn. There's also recent data showing that generally aid is falling. International aid fell in 2024 by 7.1% in real terms compared to 2023, which is the first drop after 5 years of consecutive growth. So what would be a credible response, do you think, then, for Africa to take now against this demolition, both of the USAID model and the wider drop in aid?
The path forward is going to be more market-based financing mechanisms, inevitably, because the monies that are coming through the bilateral channel is too small. The rich government's money is too small. Market-based financing means that, like the World Bank does, you go into the market, you borrow large amounts of money on using bonds, but the private sector gives it to you at a lower interest rate because they believe that somehow the World Bank has figured out a way not to default. And so when the World Bank lends it to poor countries, it knows how to collect it back. And one of the ways in which we ensure that this is we give the World Bank and others like it the so-called preferred creditor status, PCS. So they get paid first, or they get paid no matter what, even if a country is defaulting. So if there is a way in which the World Bank could take more of that money from the private sector and give it to poor countries and get it back, it will help everyone because it will be at a much lower cost to those countries than what they could borrow on the commercial markets, which is maybe 8%, 9% or whatever. The World Bank will lend to them at 2.5%, 3%.
So you think it should still be delivered through those multilateral institutions, the World Bank, IMF? You're not necessarily arguing for kind of private finance in itself, which is quite unaccountable.
Private finance is expensive. And as you rightly pointed out, it's entirely dependent on domestic accountability mechanisms. So you're not going to be able to get enough of it directly. Not only is it expensive, it's also out of reach. Ghana now doesn't even have capital market access. If it went into to try and issue a Eurobond, it probably will not get any people to buy. If you got people to buy, they'll demand ridiculous amounts of interest. So that means, therefore, what the World Bank and the IMF and others have figured out, that somehow by being in between investors and the countries, they can provide assurance that the money is safe and lend to the countries at lower costs is the only real big game in town. The one thing that all of them can do is policy accountability. Because even in authoritarian countries like China and the rest, they found a way to be accountable on policy outcomes. In that sense, this is regime agnostic.
During our conversation, Bright repeatedly came back to one issue that he believes is core to the effectiveness of aid spending in Africa. What he calls the need to nurture a policy community in a country. That's a group of people who closely monitor how aid and other government programs in their country are delivered to understand what works and what doesn't.
Policy, unlike politics, cannot, by its very nature, accommodate the majority in a country. My view is that policy accountability is very different from political accountability. So political accountability, everybody is involved. Primarily, everybody is asserting their rights and their benefits. And you need to then figure out how to do it. How to do it, only a smaller number of people typically are involved. So it's not surprising then that countries like China and the rest manage to do a lot of this without democracy, because political accountability is not the same as policy accountability. So long as the Chinese elite were themselves the audience of national policy, and they could critique particular policies in think tanks, in the party schools, in various committees, there was accountability as to whether or not, if China said they were doing this, they were actually doing it. And what was the result and what was the outcome? If you go to an African country, the policy communities were very constrained. And often the vast number of politicians, people in academia, people in business, etc., were not really part of these debates. So a lot of policies, including global health design in the countries, were put in place, promoted with zero real accountability on the ground. I am one of the most vocal activists in policy in Ghana. I still don't know what the Global Fund is doing in Ghana. Because even though there's supposed to be a country coordination mechanism, the effort to really engage in debates and to say this is what we are prioritizing, this is why we are prioritizing this, etc., is very minimal. So when you have that kind of situation, it wasn't surprising that when USAID was gutted, a lot of the backlash and the outrage was in the West, not in Africa. Why? Because USAID was spending 90% of its money through contractors and consultants and likes based in Europe and America. 10% came through local partners. Very little of that was accountable to the people. Very few people knew what was going on, even including senior politicians.
What about the issue that we've been talking about here about development dependence? So, for instance, you mentioned it, PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. That's provided funding for over 20 years. And the African continent, still is heavily reliant upon it for HIV epidemic control. So what's the exit strategy from something so specific as that, that's really helping people right now, and that's going to be removed?
A lot of PEPFAR's successes was based on policy successes around being able to drop the price of HIV medicine. Without dropping the price of HIV medicine by over 10 times at various intervals, we would not have PEPFAR success at all. Being able to do that involved working together with the pharmaceutical companies, providing assurances and guarantees and all manner of things. Those policies must be implementable within regional bodies, for instance. So Africa has an African Union. During COVID, we started to experiment with pooled procurement, which would drop the price of things we buy so we can distribute them. What I'm trying to say is that PEPFAR is important in terms of the money that it has, but in terms of the actual money, it's not that significant. Let me give you an example. You think of a country like Nigeria. Why should a country like Nigeria, which is very rich in natural resources in terms of the talents of its people and the rest of it, be so dependent on a foreign government to fund most of their HIV response? It's only because we've delegated the policy making. So if you get the policies right, you wouldn't need the US to do it. My view is that the gap between policies and policies are so strong in some countries, especially countries in Africa, that without fixing that, you basically dependent forever, which is an outcome that none of us want.
So the solution to that would be a much more engaged and broader kind of set of people who are analysing these contracts, who are really questioning, who are making policy suggestions from a local perspective.
The truth of the matter is that you do need communities in the countries that are large enough, vibrant enough, engaged enough to be part of this decision making. You need to know this is why we have this particular problem, this is where we are with that problem, etc. So for instance, if it's about getting more people to have HIV medicines, it's not that different from a problem that Ghana faces today, which is not going to be funded by aid people. And that is that we have a lot more kidney failure problems. So we need to figure out dialysis and stuff like that. Are we going to wait till the US government creates a program for kidney disease in Africa before we get along with it and fix it. Because the US government doesn't have one now. Somehow we are figuring it out. It doesn't have one for diabetes. It doesn't have one for hypertension. How are you going to figure that out if all you're doing is waiting for a US president to decide that this is a presidential initiative for diabetes? So in the same way that you can't wait for that, if it was necessary that you did it for HIV, you would do it for HIV. You will need to come together as African countries to figure out ways to do pool procurement of medicines, etc. Drop down that price, and you do all the coordination of policy which will make the problem manageable. You cannot delegate and outsource that strategy to the largesse of a foreign country.
Okay, well, Bright, thank you so much. It's been a fascinating call and we've covered a lot. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you so very much, Dima.
That's it for this week's episode. We'll put some links to more reading from the conversation about the USAID cuts in our episode show notes. This episode was written and produced by Mend Marawani and me, Gemma Ware, with sound design and mixing by Eloise Stevens. Our theme music is by Nita Saal. You can email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com, and you can sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. And just a quick reminder of our message at the top of this episode. If you'd like to support the work of The Conversation, please consider going to donate.theconversation.com. That's donate.theconversation.com. Thanks very much for listening.